All right, good to go. Cool. Well, my name's Kelsie Nabben. I came in very late last night, all the way from Australia to join you. And I'm a researcher, so I am a PhD student at RMIT University in Melbourne in the Blockchain Innovation Hub, very cool sounding unit, and the Centre for Automated Decision Making in Society. And so how today kind of came about was I wrote a piece in CoinDesk at the end of last year for their Culture Week, talking about how crypto is a LARP, and some of the core team at Friends with Benefits picked that up and invited me to speak, which I was really excited about. So I'm kind of LARPing as a friend with benefits. I'm in the Discord, but I don't go here. But I was very proud of myself for wearing a matching outfit with Greg today. So all I need is a pink hat and I'm good. So also, I'm LARPing kind of as a researcher here. So I'm an ethnographer, and that's a big word for a social scientist that studies people and culture and community. And so while I'm here at Friends with Benefits, I kind of have some questions. So I'm really grateful that you're listening today, and I'm going to kind of extend an invitation towards the end. And so thank you as well to the previous speaker who so kind of eloquently set out a bit of a historical mode, which I hope to kind of build a floor on, and also laid out some really interesting provocations, which I'd like to continue that thread. So how did we get here? Here as in the Friends with Benefits Fest and the literal pin drop, which I think was an art installation for some stargazing last night. But how did we get to a social DAO? How did we get to a forest festival? How did we get to this focus on kind of art and technology and to gather people from all over America and all around the world to participate in whatever this is? So I want to go through a little bit of some historical origins, more of crypto culture than kind of Web3 or NFTs or technology or anything. And then I want to talk a little bit more about LARPing and then the research that I'm doing. So on origins, and this thinking was shared a couple days ago actually in Friends with Benefits Works in Progress, so shout out to the editorial team there that were amazing to work with and very engaged in the writing. And so the origins of public decentralized, with an S because I'm from Australia, network communities are political. It's not just a nice idea, it's not just a social club, but there's very deep political origins to cryptocurrency coming out of public key cryptography. And so a bunch of my research has been on these historical origins, or how did decentralized technologies being open source, peer-to-peer, distributed networks come about. And I sort of break that down into these three key phases in history. And there's so many more characters you could talk about, but you have to, I guess, start and bound the investigation somewhere. And so those three phases come down, for me, to distributed computing, public key cryptography, and a countercultural subculture called the cypherpunks. And so starting in the 1960s, there's a fellow by the name of Paul Barron, and he starts working at RAND Corporation, which is a government-funded think tank in America. And this is kind of pre the height of the Cold War era, and he's trying to think about, as an engineer, ways to make resilient communication systems. And so he comes up with the idea of distributed communications. So how, instead of one server, which if it gets attacked means that government officials cannot communicate to coordinate any kind of defense or response, be actually distributed across multiple servers across the country. So if one communication center goes down, there's redundancy, there's backups, and there's still ways to communicate. And so there's a bunch of really incredible papers actually on the RAND website. Paul Barron himself is kind of Internet Hall of Fame for his contributions, and was sort of a mentor to some of the key people involved in ARPANET, which became the internet. And so there's this one strand about resilience through distributing the actual architecture of a system or the physical kind of hardware. The second historical strand comes up with the public key cryptographers. And so public key cryptography, as we know it, is really fancy maths, which I myself am not an expert in, but it's a way to communicate securely over insecure channels. So how can you get a message from A to B, Alice to Bob? No matter what happens, only Bob can read it and no one else, even if they see it. And so that's why nowadays we interact with cryptography, and that's just like the string of our wallet address, and we don't really think about it, or we kind of have our seed phrase or whatever. But this is kind of some of our origins. And so these algorithms were actually invented in the UK by the UK intelligence services, and they were shared with the NSA. But what happened was there was other characters that were also really interested in these ideas around secure communications. And so in the 1970s, a fellow by the name of Whitfield Diffie, who was known as kind of a bit of a kind of divergent person, sort of anti-bureaucratic in many ways, coincided with Martin Hellman, who was working at a university at the time, and they started talking about the research that they had been doing as cryptographers. And so Hellman's student, Ralph Merkel, also kind of participated in their conversations and writing papers, and one of those papers with Diffie and Hellman's name on it is New Directions in Cryptography, and that shares some of these innovations where they kind of discovered the same techniques that the intelligence agencies had also developed after decades and decades of using encryption. And they believed that access to that information should be free and publicly available. So it was partly around privacy and partly kind of a pragmatic argument around business and commerce. So the era that followed is kind of known as the crypto wars, and I don't know if people have heard that language resurface, especially with some of the recent events around Tornado Cash and actually the US kind of sanctioning of that protocol. But the crypto wars is this era where it's often written about as kind of the public key cryptographers or the advocates, kind of fighting the government, like David versus Goliath, and this like victory of the little man. But in many ways, it was a dialogue. So Diffie and Hellman, contribute to policy directions. They're on boards, and you can find some of their written responses or testimonies that kind of try and explain this technology and why open access is really important. And the government puts out, encryption standards saying, okay, you can have encryption, but it has to be, the DES, which was data encryption standard, just one that they put out. And the argument was, this isn't strong enough. This isn't strong enough for our banking networks. This isn't strong enough for us to export technology, and it's also a violation of individual privacy. And so this backwards and forwards kind of leads to the emergence of a few key characters. And one of those characters that's part of the cryptography community is David Chaum. And Chaum is kind of like the forefather of digital money. And so I don't know if anyone here has kind of been around crypto conferences for a little while, but you might have actually seen him kind of wandering the corridors. He was at DevCon. He has a crypto project now. It was called Elixir last time I checked. So he's still around. He gave a lecture as well, which is on YouTube at a conference I ran called Ukiyo, where he really kind of, broke it down and to the kind of next generation, which was pretty amazing. But Chaum comes along and has this another kind of breakthrough moment, and he talks about the importance of digital cash. So the idea that money can go digital, and that is encrypted by nature, so kind of natively encrypted. And that attracts some serious interest from some interesting fellows, including Brian Wilcox, who you may know as Zuko, one of the founders of Zcash, as well as Eric Hughes, who goes on to co-found the Cypherpunks mailing list with Timothy C. May. And so a couple of these characters kind of go to Amsterdam, they go there to work on DigiCash. The difference is that DigiCash thinks that they can enter contracts with big corporates. So they kind of try to negotiate with Microsoft, the deal falls through. And there's a few dependencies in the architecture of the system. So it still has some kind of centralized moments which some of the engineers and cryptographers on the team kind of disagree with. And pretty much it falls apart, the project falls apart, personalities clash, and it ends up eventually filing for bankruptcy. But what happens is Eric Hughes comes back to the US and meets Tim May, this kind of, again, like larger than life character in the kind of crypto history books, who's you know, a hard out libertarian, kind of known for like you know, guns and ranches, and he's, you know, retired off his Intel stocks as an engineer. And in the late 1980s, he wrote the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto, which some of you might have seen kind of quotes from here and there. Again, like these histories are kind of peppered throughout what is now called Web3, but not, you know, hugely emphasized or discussed. But so this manifesto kind of inspires him and Hughes to start this online mailing list. And, you know, really all it is like a few kind of Bay Area men really that, you know, want to talk about the societal possibilities of public key cryptography. And so they have a couple of in-person meetups where they play some games around, you know, how would an anonymous remailer work? You know, how can we forward messages to each other without knowing where they come from? And the list kind of grows, you know, like 100, 200, and its peak like 700 members. And Hughes writes the Cypherpunk Manifesto, which you can also find readily available online. And then a lot of the ideas that the group discusses, and, you know, Zuko appears on there, Diffie appears on there, Charm never appears on there because of the differences in personality and politics from before. A lot of these ideas are kind of canonized in this very, very long document, again, which is available on the web, called Cyphernomicon, which was compiled by May. And so the list goes on and kind of morphs and changes. It gets, you know, wildly spammed. May gets more and more extreme in his kind of advocacy of anonymous markets, no matter what the kind of social outcomes of that, you know, and there's kind of talk of, you know, anonymous assassination markets and things which some people disagree with. And he ends up leaving his own list kind of somewhere in the 2000s. And, you know, it dies down. People start new lists, the cryptographers mailing list, which is censored, so kind of the founder would approve posts pretty much to have less noise and more kind of high quality, you know, research where people could share more kind of pure ideas and so on. So it goes quiet. And then in 2008, these ideas kind of culminate, and, you know, the list had been through cycles of particular technological features. You know, there's BitGold, there's other kind of innovations in distributed monies that kind of build on the DigiCash ideas, and they make different innovations along the way. So, you know, coming up with kind of proof of work and so on through different characters, Wei Dai and so on. And then goes quiet, and then 2008, this pseudonymous character, Satoshi Nakamoto, emerges with the Bitcoin white paper. And there's interviews online that talk about the kind of reaction to this as like another day on the internet, you know, like nothing super exciting here, a couple of pages. We see papers like this all the time. And forums pop up, Bitcoin Talk forum, and Satoshi's kind of responding to questions, and Hal Finney, who was on the Cypherpunk's mailing list, kind of becomes a code maintainer for the open source software code base of Bitcoin. And so somehow these deep and intertwined origins bring us here today to a social DAO, to a forest festival in Idyllwild, to some really incredible, DJ sets and musicians that I'm looking forward to this evening. And so I want to kind of ground us in some of this history to think about, potentially the politics or the ideologies of our actions today. And that's really what my research question is about being here. I'm not saying that I know the answers, but I want to ask the questions. So how is this a LARP, or what is a LARP? So a live action roleplay refers to games where participants physically portray their characters by wearing costumes, assuming personas, and pursuing goals within real-world environments while interacting with other players in character. There's a really amazing scene in one of those weird Disney TV series about a girl who's an archer, where he goes to a LARP. I don't know if anyone saw that. Anyway, highly recommend. It's like a slow motion LARP. He has to go and get his suit back. But I actually saw that while I was writing the original piece in CoinDesk, which is referenced here. But this kind of, role-playing game can be, educational or political, but it has goals to awaken or to shape thinking. And it's an essential part of learning, this kind of participatory, playful learning. So it's obvious kind of from this definition that crypto is a bit of a LARP, People talk about, we're all here to experiment, and it's kind of this way to make it really lighthearted and fun and, have, memes that people share to kind of perpetuate ideas. And so these series of live action role plays encourage experimentation and failure, which the last talk kind of spoke about too. Failure is success because we can learn something from these activities. And so what do we see kind of evolving in the social connections and clubs and communities in crypto? They've been called clubs. They've been called decentralized autonomous corporations, which are now have evolved to this very general idea of decentralized autonomous organization. And I have a lot of writing kind of looking at DAO patterns and DAOs from different interdisciplinary kind of perspectives, kind of arguing that we don't know what it is yet. It's not really defined. Someone asked me on a podcast actually, is Bitcoin a DAO? And to early people thinking about what a DAC was, the answer is yes. But does that help us to define what DAOs are today or what they will be? Not really. The metaverse, so, evolved again to kind of compete in a way with corporate players. There's the Facebook Meta sort of attempt to claim the space from, cryptocurrency payments to the idea of open, interoperable communities that cross borders between digital and physical boundaries. To ad hoc events, and shout out to my supervisor, one of my supervisors at RMIT, Ellie Rennie. She has a fantastic piece just on her Medium blog on the idea of the pop-up economy that came from her notes attending a party in Melbourne where some dev friends of ours created wallets. So when you arrived at their house in their garage, they had a fishbowl of cash and they would give you flex bucks. And so the kind of exchange rate was wild. So you just had a lot of money in flex bucks for your $20 or $50 that you had put in. And in their house for the evening, you could exchange through this web-based wallet to buy plants, buy meals, auction. I think there was a pair of jeans that got split in two because they couldn't decide who wanted it more. And it just goes to show kind of, people will get involved in anything. And then Ellie and I have a piece on the Internet Policy Review in a glossary on ad hoc events or ad hoc networks. So we kind of talk about the history of ad hoc networks and how they've kind of developed, and then move into this sort of, really kind of provocation around DAOs and pop-up economies as sort of an evolution of ad hoc networks as well. And more recently, the book just came out, but for a while it's been an idea, and you can go back and watch the kind of Foresight Institute talks from Balaji on the idea of network states, and Vitalik Buterin responded to that, so it's sort of well known in the crypto Twitter sphere now. But again, these kind of live action role plays popping up in these really strong ideas where an online community could crowdfund and coordinate to, purchase, real world assets like land, and actually garner enough political influence to, negotiate with nation state level actors in their kind of sovereignty or autonomy within that context. And so, again, kind of going back a couple of years, Stuart Brand, who's kind of a hacker culture activist, infamous culture changer person, and is part of the Long Now Foundation now, one of the founders of that, spoke about finite and infinite games as kind of the best book he'd ever read at DevCon. He was the keynote speaker in Prague. And so this idea has re-emerged, and actually Key references it in her piece on guild right towards the end. And the thing that stood out to Brent, and I guess stood out to me about this like very short kind of religious philosophical text by James Cass, is that the goal is not to win, but to keep on playing. And I think that's a really interesting idea when it comes to crypto and the ways that the space portrays itself to kind of the outside world as non-political and non-threatening. So I don't want to re-politicize it today, but I do have some questions. So in what ways are these finite and infinite games also serious games? And so I got some head nods to the kind of tornado cash thing, and there was this fantastic tweet by Kane from Synthetics on Twitter just this week. So he quoted, "If you didn't realize genuine adversarial behavior from state actors would expose the decentralization LARPers in the space, you've really been asleep at the wheel." And so the tornado cash thing is kind of unprecedented, because rather than sanctioning a person, they've sanctioned a protocol. And so it raises a lot of questions about kind of, what's next. And I think, some of the seriousness of, DAOs, even like social DAOs, the fact that we're having fun at a festival, comes in when you talk to lawyers. And I was actually doing research when I realized this, and a lawyer colleague of mine, Joni Pirovich in Australia, talked about liability and really like the risk that any founder of a DAO takes on, given the kind of legal grey status for, what we're seeing with, even some of the groups participating in this, such as the collective action against Uniswap. But even as a participant, in a DAO, as a token holder, there is potential that you could be held liable. So go and get independent legal advice was my finding from that, and do some fancy things with corporate entities. So I think it's really interesting just to look back at some of those historical origins, because the cypherpunks were acutely aware that, what they were doing was super, adversarial. And I think crypto project founders prior to now have also had that awareness. Some of the interviews, with Zuko about founding a privacy coin, Zcash is like, this could be it, like this, like risking it all for kind of a belief in the values and those underlying ideologies of a technology. And so linking that to culture, and the idea that, Friends with Benefits, edge is really on its creativity. And the reason I decided to actually do research while here rather than just kind of attend and hang out is because I was told that people are participating, people are bringing something, people are selling their own t-shirts in the Discord channel, or they're, doing DJ sets, or they're, doing art installations, live art, performance, meditation, all of these things. And so a story kind of on the historical side, and forgive me for being a bit preachy, looking back to the Old Testament, you can see these people here, out the front of a war march with the trumpets. And so this story is like very Pentecostal around the idea that, culture leads the way for societal change. Like you lead this, marching out to take the land with trumpets, not with swords. And so what are we LARPing about? That's kind of my research question while I'm here. That's what I want to know from each of you. So these cultural expressions of writing, music, and art lead change in society. Are we taking these roles seriously? We also need to have fun with them, back to that point about finite and infinite games. But, is Friends with Benefits here to kind of make change? Why? What kind of change? And so I've talked a little about my role as an ethnographer, but really it's surfacing, in this space, in this dynamic, surfacing the social outcomes of decentralized technology. And so standing up some of those political ideologies and, origins and, intentions, good intentions many times, against what happens when people use these tools. And so I've looked across, DAOs and how people govern, algorithmic processes. A lot of my writing as well, I kind of share as I go. It's kind of like open source writing, so it's pretty much all on the internet. I've also done some research on decentralized storage, so looking at IPFS and Filecoin, and in what contexts do people use these tools for censorship resistance? How do they set them up? What non-active threats are there to the storage of our data, such as the preservation of Indigenous languages and the education in language? And what undermines the resilience of those systems? Is it that rather than wanting to use a global kind of storage network, they rent a server? In some cases, yes. And then the last part of my PhD journey is really around open hardware. So looking all the way back down to that fundamental level of kind of where I started on distributed computing, down to the microchips. And there's a project called Kong that have kind of a metaverse play that are doing verifiable hardware chips and a bunch of stuff in the NFT space as well. I encourage you to check them out. They're very cool. And so is Friends with Benefits Fest about just a party? Someone I work with, one of the institutional economists at the Blockchain Hub, kind of laughed at me. I was like, no, they're a social DAO. And he's like, oh yeah, sure, that's what everyone says when they want to make money. I was like, oh, I'm so naive. Is it about the token going up? Like money's not bad either. It's a resource. It can be very helpful when you want to do things, scale things, enact change, or share ideas and so on. Is it change? Maybe it's not. Maybe I'm wrong with that provocation. Is it about a status quo thing? Is it about creative expression, or so on? And by whom, how, and why? So a couple of things that I've learned so far, and I had so much fun in the very long car rental line yesterday, just kind of surfing through Twitter and the Friends with Benefits Discord to see like what's up, like what are people doing at Friends with Benefits, what are people thinking, what are they finding? And the great thing about social media is people share that, and then you can use it as research data in digital ethnography. And just to point out, I do have ethics approval from some of the core team at Friends with Benefits, but if you do not want to be included in research, you can point that out. Obviously, I won't individually identify people if I speak to you, unless it's already publicly available, like you've tweeted or something, because that is on the internet. So one of my first things, I'll just take a sip of water and check the time, and then I'll talk about mushrooms. Yeah, so one of my first things was mushrooms. There was just like a lot of excitement in Discord and like little mushroom emojis vibrating violently. And then just to notice that these beautiful installations kind of have a strange likeness. But can we go a little bit deeper than that? So I wonder if she's here. I don't know. I'm assuming it's a she, but there was this beautiful tweet saying, "So what brought me to Idyllwild, a small town so far from the city after a 3-hour drive down the middle of nowhere from LA? Friends with Benefits Fest." Oh, there? Hey, welcome. Good to see you. A community festival of which I am a member. I love that quote. Thank you so much for sharing it. I'm probably the only one coming all the way from Japan, and I waved back at you and I said Australia, and I'm like, I don't want to know what time it is there now. So I love that, and that idea of belonging, and a lot of people, especially in crypto, talk about the kind of COVID era, and some people have talked about that that cultural phenomenon of GM or good morning as kind of the way to like check in or present in the office for the day, or just have someone say a GM back as you kind of go between like your desk and your bed because you couldn't leave the house, and that's coming from the world's longest lockdown in Melbourne, Australia. And so what else? So there's the idea that community means belonging, and the internet has long been that. It's kind of like how, when you don't have shared interests with anyone around you, can you find your tribe? And actually, I've heard, like the Cypherpunks is a great example of that, really. Finding people that share your interests, that you're more alike than anyone you know, kind of IRL or in real life. Also, I've observed this idea of new economies. And so on Friends with Benefits tweets that, there's just notifications out to the community about what's happening around the festival. And, this idea that all proceeds go directly to the artists, and that, decentralized technologies create this peer-to-peer economy and the possibility to disintermediate middlemen. And there was a great piece on Works in Progress which interviews some of the artists that are performing here, and there's a quote from Pussy Riot that says, the music industry I joined was not the music industry that I thought it was. Some of the dynamics that go on in a big industry, a big bureaucracy, and then this animating idea, and actually Jose, who's part of the core team of Friends with Benefits, leaned into some tweets that happened from someone else about LARPs before this event, like, I'm calling it, like, this is one big LARP. But a digital city that would come to life offline. So like this online to offline. And in many ways, that is exactly these theories that we as kind of scholars have talked about, of the pop-up economy, or, ad hoc networks, the fact that we can, bump in, like set up this crazy city of people from all around the world with shared interests and shared experiences, and then in 2 days it will disseminate again and be gone. There'll be hardly any trace here physically, but to see what emerges from this will be very interesting. Oh, back one. I knew I'd have to go back. Oh no. Okay, yes, good. So this is my invitation, I said it would come, to please contribute to the research if you would like. It's a very kind of simple question in terms of this provocation of, what are we LARPing about? And it's a very personal one as well. And so if you're comfortable, I will be checking the Discord channel throughout the weekend, but that for me formulates research data, which I get to do qualitative analysis on. So looking at your photos, your quotes, whatever, and trying to understand, what is really going on here. And so if you go in the friendswithbenefits.fest channel, just throughout the weekend, if you want to share any photos of what you see, like I want to see through your eyes and understand your experiences better. So I would love for you to be a part of the research, and I hope to write this up and share it. And I'm sure the Friends with Benefits team will do their phenomenal thing and help point to where that is when it happens. And this I just wanted to share because the team made a really cool tile for my talk, but that's my details. And thank you so much for listening. I'd love to stay around and chat.